grist for our conversation. You know, we've been doing this for 3 years. I don't think I've heard this much buzz. And so I'm really excited. Joan, do you want to join me up here? And we'll just see if some of your students want to ask some questions and some of our students. And then anybody wants to ask a question and go at it. Who's first? Wow, this has never happened. Here we go, over here.
My name is George Ranty. I'm a MERP student. My question is pertaining to public transportation. I know that you mentioned that the 3-mile track down Woodward for light rail, that would be privately funded. But if you were to expand the public transportation sector, where would the funding come from for that?
Federal government. And in fact, they've gotten, I think you probably have the detail on it, there was some stimulus money that was intended for public transportation, but for mass transit. But Detroit had no mass transit, so it couldn't get any of the stimulus money. But they since have figured out how to get at least a piece of it. I mean, I think it's probably under some threat now because of the current budgetary situation.
Question? Over here.
My name is Frank Stolz. I'm from the MIRA Coalition, which is an immigrant advocacy coalition. It seems to me that there's actually a disagreement between the two of you about shrinking the city. Do you think you could flesh that out a bit?
You know, maybe it's just maybe I'm just being an optimist. I would just say that, you know, we hear a lot about shrinking cities, and generally people are talking about cities that are in decline population-wise. But shrinking cities is about taking land out of service or even taking it out of city boundaries, right? Like kind of selling it off, releasing it, or, as Dan was saying, not providing full services to it. Certainly when you talk about residential areas, probably that's when you come into questions around service provision and that type of thing. My point was simply that I think that the first step I would do before I would think about getting rid of land is to think about how you can use land and how you can use it for valuable, productive use. Detroit does have an opportunity here, as do the other Midwestern cities, I think, because of this industrial land. Now, it might be that, you know, the country has just moved too far that we're not going to go back and create new manufacturing jobs or new sort of industrially related jobs. But I think in Washington and then also people who work in cities and around urban industrial projects have a different vision, that they think that you know, very broadly based industrial strategies, and it might include craft manufacturing. It might include, you know, a lot of sort of small scale manufacturing, but also, you know, the transportation and logistics. A lot of that stuff should be in cities and has been pushed out of cities because there hasn't been land available. You go to the Midwest and they're swimming in land. There's a site in Flint where essentially you can take what were a couple of old assembly sites and put together about a 600-acre parcel. One of those is the largest piece of it, I think, is a single 250-acre parcel. And after we saw this, we went back to our office and kind of challenged the research staff to find an industrial parcel on the East Coast that was as big. And we found one in Raleigh, North Carolina, that was an old Coke bottling plant. But other than that, you simply don't find large parcels. And one of the things about land, it's really hard to put back together. And so I think you have to consider that this really might be an opportunity where you have industrial transportation infrastructure, a really broadly skilled labor force, and huge tracts of land, which you just simply don't see on the coasts. So I would start there. I would start there and say, you know, as a national asset, this can be a national asset, and how do we build it out there? And then if that turns out not to work, then maybe you think about, you know, a second land option.
So I guess we don't disagree that much, because I was speaking largely about residential shrinkage. The footprint of Detroit, 140 square miles, once accommodated at single house density, not apartment density, nearly 2 million people. It's still 140 square miles, and it has fewer than half that many people, and there's just no way that any city, much less a desperately broke city, can provide fair services or build a functioning school system. In terms of the industrial end, I think that Teresa's right. There's a lot there. There's some complications. Often it's contaminated. One of the biggest public works projects in Detroit in recent years was the decontamination of a huge rubber factory, a tire factory that was along the Detroit River. Employed a lot of people to get the poisons out of the ground. There are brownfields all over Detroit that presumably could be used either for industrial development or they could be turned into parkland. They could be let them revert to nature. I think that there's a virtue there as well.
I wonder if I could ask a question, and then we'll keep going here. In order to revivify a city, to really bring it back, revitalize the city, you've got to attract young people. Do you see any indication that Detroit can bring in young people, and why would they go there?
I mean, I think it's potentially the next Brooklyn. It's a cheap version of Brooklyn, and the uber hip kids know about it. So I think we're two kind of Ubers away from movement, but.
Dan and I were Ubers when
Oh, you were? Yeah.
But not him. Hips.
And I think there's some of it there. There's artist colonies. There's the ability, as Dan was mentioning, you can buy houses really cheaply. This gives people a lot of options around communal living, around live workspaces, this sort of thing. And there's kind of a buzz nationally about Detroit. The question is how much of it, how much of how much can you kind of get that momentum and build on it?
I mean, what I saw in my reporting there is that there are young people coming back into the city because it is inexpensive. You can buy loft buildings that has the downtown is in much better shape than the downtown of a city of this nature should be. And I was there on a September night when the Tiger baseball game was ending the same time as the show at the Fox Theater and at the Michigan Opera House, and the jazz clubs, and the streets were filled with people. He said, "This is a vital, vital city." Well, they got in their cars and they went home to the suburbs. But the young people the problem isn't young people. It's once the young people have children, getting them to stay in the city when they do not feel safe, when they do not feel there's a school system. That's the difficulty. It's keeping young people, not getting them to come in there.
All the way back.
I'm Bill Sisk. I'm a political science master's student, and I have a question specifically about, sort of going for the future development of building around manufacturing. There seems to be a lot of difficulties with even sort of new manufacturing strategies, because on the one hand you're seeing something that's shrinking not just with Detroit, across the nation for a long time. It's decreasing, and then you're having to compete with wages or land prices, globally that don't have minimum wage standards as we do, or you're dealing with processes that are largely automated. So I know you were talking a little bit about craft manufacturing, but I mean, what sorts of industries do you think that could succeed in Detroit? And I guess how many jobs can you realistically expect that to create?
Yeah, so we're not done with the industrial strategy, so I'm just going to kind of point in some directions it might be going in. There's still a lot of manufacturing that requires co-location with a certain asset, right? And so when you think about medical devices or a biofarm, a lot around health really needs access to either hospitals or high quality medical personnel. And so there are clear industries like that where they need to, especially in the early phases of production, be near a certain set of assets. A lot of things in product development in the early stages still want to co-locate near kind of the engineering portion of it. And so I think you're right that it would be really, if you're just talking about an assembly line and 500 people, probably that's not where Detroit's going to be able to grow. And so it might be a larger number of smaller manufacturing facilities. But one place that does create a fair number of jobs and eats up tons of land is around transportation, logistics, warehousing, that type of thing. And so that's another option. And then I think there are new movements, kind of new ways that the economy might or might not coalesce, but around local food systems. Detroit has probably more and better and more interesting assets there, and is way ahead of the curve on that. And so if you think about communities saying, you know what, we're going to take greater control of our food sources, right? We're going to grow more of it, we're going to process more of it. Maybe it even becomes an export industry. I think there are options there. But one of the things that Detroit has, you know, kind of, I think one of the overarching themes here is that it has terrific engineering talent, and it has a great, you know, kind of discovery and innovative talent. If you could even catch the first generation of firms coming out of that, you would create a lot of jobs.
I don't know much about that kind of economic development, but I think that there's the logic that if you create any kind of job, every job created creates another job, or every 10 jobs created creates another job. And I think of, I mean, my father was a very small-time lawyer in his own office, and all of his business was people who worked for the auto companies. And that was the same for the barber and the grocer and everybody else. So it may not necessarily be large-scale manufacturing, but simply economic activity generating more economic activity.
Let me just add, because we've been looking at manufacturing, you know, very closely here in Massachusetts, and we did a big report at the Dukakis Center. But it's also clear that right now, manufacturing is actually helping lead us out of this recession. We've been creating tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs. In fact, we're creating manufacturing jobs right now in Massachusetts. And the question is, will Michigan, and particularly southeastern Michigan, get its share of that revival in manufacturing? Yeah, you got to put the mic right up close.
I'm looking at how aging, gender relations, racial and ethnic diversity, as well as immigration and education, in terms of the makeup of the people there, and compared to what's going on in the country. When you look at innovation and you look at entrepreneurship is really sort of driving a large part of the turnaround of the economy. Are the people there motivated to grow? Are they capable? Are they an older generation that are headed towards retirement that don't really have younger people?
It's a very
get a feel for the kinds of people that are really living in.
It's a very tough and sensitive issue, because at the individual mom and pop entrepreneurial level, all the entrepreneurial energy is immigrant. It's Mexican, it's Arab, and it's Eastern European. The neighborhood, Mexican Town, is the most vital working neighborhood in the city, because it has the vitality of immigrant societies, of people who are trying to build something and are hugely resented by the people who have been in Detroit forever. So you want it to happen, but there are people who feel that they are losing because of its happening. This Mexican Town neighborhood is really, it's a fascinating place. It was a majority African-American neighborhood through the 1970s that elected the same man to the state legislature for 20 years, and when he stepped down, he turned his seat over to a Hungarian immigrant, a woman who worked on his staff, and then she was in for 8 years, and then she turned it over to a Mexican, who's turned it over to a Palestinian woman who was born in Palestine and came here. And it's a fantastic story, and you know, they're getting along and working well.
Thank you. Over here. Yes.
So
Wait for the mic, would you, please?
Hi, my name is Joe, and I'm a planning student over at MIT. So this might be sort of an unanswerable question, but you both spoke to the importance of the city working together with the suburbs for a sort of more equitable distribution of assets, and how that's the key to bringing resources back into the city. I guess, how do you envision that working, and is that something that's going to be dictated by the state? Because this is a huge problem for cities throughout the country that don't have this history of racial and economic segregation and tension.
Yeah, I'm not a big regionalist, so probably how I think about it is influenced by that. And so when I think about it, you know, I think that relying on cooperation or assuming cooperation between cities and suburbs, not just in Detroit, in a lot of places, that wouldn't be an assumption I would make lightly, especially in an environment that's so jobs constrained, right, where you actually could have competition for job creation and that sort of thing. My view is that Detroit needs to lead the region in this, and really needs to, you know, I think that they have very good political leadership now, things that they haven't had in a while. And they have tremendous assets. It's still the biggest city in the state. It's still, you know, when you look at, you know, Detroit drives most of the Southeast Michigan economy, which drives most of the state economy. I mean, you have to get Detroit right. I think you're absolutely right. I don't know what the answer is. I think cities taking leadership in regional strategies, I think coming up with, I mean, you start to get a little inside baseball on this about, you know, the voting structures around, you know, regional assets and these sorts of things. I don't think nationally it's actually been worked out in a way that does justice to cities. And I think that we probably need a vision of it, that a kind of city-centered regionalism. And Detroit might be a good place to start with that.
I think that Detroit could be a good place, but I think that the primary thing that will motivate regionalism is coercive and desperation, coercion and desperation. Let me illustrate. Cobo Arena is the convention center in the city of Detroit, and it's there are four agencies that governments that have historically had an interest in it: Oakland County, Wayne County, Detroit, and Macomb County. But Detroit was saying for 20 years, yes, you're part of the authority, and we, you know, the tax money that we need to operate the place comes from you. But it's in Detroit, so you have no say over how it's controlled. Well, Detroit's a little bit more desperate now, and there's finally going to be some agreement on that. It's the same thing in the reverse. The suburbs really didn't have to care about Detroit until the poison spread. The recent economic catastrophe, which has been so horrible in southeastern Michigan, has forced, as I said, Oakland County now has to talk to Detroit because Detroit is hurting them. They're feeling it very, very acutely. The political leadership has to be forced into cooperating where they leave before they could live on islands. Detroit has another asset, and this is a little bit of a problem with the state legislature. All the suburbs of Detroit, something like 73 communities, buy their water from the city of Detroit. The waterworks on the Detroit riverfront. That is the water plant. And so the city of Detroit would like to say, you know, we'd like some bus service, and we'll, you know, unless you give us some better bus service, we're going to, you know, raise the cost of the water. The legislature won't let them do that. You need a political miracle of some sort, but, you know, we've had political miracles before.
I would also say that you have the recent election yielded a Republican governor who's actually quite pro-Detroit and ran on a pro-Detroit platform. And so, you know, you might be able to trump some of the challenges between city and regional cooperation by having, you know, all of their bosses kind of say, you know, this is how we're going to view Detroit within the state going forward.
Yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Franco with the economics department at Northeastern undergrad. My question really, it's funny, I read a book about how Detroit was similar to Silicon Valley when it started, and how small businesses and innovation, which several people touched upon, sort of hinged upon the small business. And we all know in this economy that the biggest hiring force in the United States economy is small business. So my question to Teresa is, you know, is there a promise for small business in terms of the aggregate, if they're going to have some pull in Detroit? And what do they need to do that? And then, Dan, you also touched upon it in terms of Mexican mom and pop small businesses. Would they have a pull in it, or would it be bigger businesses, not mom and pop businesses, but sort of middle ground businesses that innovate new technology?
I think Dan in his talk hit on a really important issue, which is the legacy of large firms in Detroit. And I think it created a huge institutional challenges and cultural challenges. It's remarkable how much the large automakers control Detroit, but especially you see it more strongly actually in Flint, where GM really. And this is relevant because what ended up happening is a lot of this infrastructure that we think about in terms of business development or a culture around business development and innovation was all within four walls of of these firms. These firms disappear. There's not this sort of institutional structure, and there's not a culture of small business. There is a culture of innovation. What it has to be is kind of turned into entrepreneurship. It's something that people who are trying to lead Detroit and the region out have identified as an area for kind of fostering, creating an infrastructure and fostering a culture there. So in my take of it, it's really it's part of the process of breaking out of the shadows of this kind of very much large firm economy. And it might be as much cultural as anything else, but it seems to be moving in the same direction. I'd be interested to see if Dan has the same
Yeah, I think
impression.
so. I'm going to say something very Republican, though I'm not a Republican. My last trip to Detroit, I was invited by some high school classmates of mine who stayed in Detroit. Some, lawyers and doctors, judges. There were 10 of us. I hadn't seen them in over 40 years, but it was kind of nice. They invited. We want to tell you about our Detroit experience. All but one of them African American, and one of them was somebody who is an engineer, a highly trained engineer, who didn't work for the auto companies, but worked for a company that was kind of connected to the auto companies. And he has the funding for a new business, and he wanted to put it in Detroit. And the Detroit permitting process would have taken him 1.5 years, whereas one of the suburbs says you can break ground tomorrow. And the reason why the permitting process takes 1.5 years is because everybody gets a piece of it. Every step along the way, somebody takes their 2% out of it. And that's something that the mayor is trying to, we have to streamline this process. But the political resistance to that, the only people who have political power in Detroit now are people who have a vested economic stake in the city. And they don't want things to change. It's terrible.
Hi, I'm Ellen Carangelo, and I'm a community member from Rossendale. I also work in affordable housing and community development. And I have a question that's a little counter to what you were just saying, but I have a question that's a little different from what you were just saying, but I'm listening to your talk about, planning and regionalism and what needs to happen, and I'm not hearing a lot about where the money's going to come from, what kinds of investors or industries or banks are looking at the plans that you're developing or that the city's developing. And I'm also, at the same time, hearing that auto companies are coming back, that, Ford's developing cars that people are going to want to buy. And so are the others. Chrysler's back. They paid back the government. So I'm wondering if the auto industry is coming back, are they going to be part of the innovation and funding mechanism for helping Detroit come back? And then the first part, where's the money going to come from? Where's the interest for the dollars to do what you're talking about?
I would have an easier answer before 2008 because the money was in the suburbs. It was there. The Detroit suburbs in Oakland, Macomb County, and Western Wayne County were in very, very good shape when the auto companies were still in good shape. So presumably, with the recovery of the auto companies, although the auto industry is not nearly as centralized as it was when Barry and I were growing up there. I mean, the auto plants are all over the country now, much more so than before. But still, the white-collar jobs are in Detroit, in greater Detroit. And when that comes back, the tax base comes back. The suburban tax base applied to the city's problems, because it's the whole region that is concerned now, could provide the opportunity, the economic opportunity.
I think there's actually a big just market play here. I think that if you make these assets transparent enough, if you do enough of the kind of information gathering for people who might invest in Detroit, so rather than say, hey, why don't you think about Detroit or recruiting an auto parts company, whatever the recruit, to literally go with packages around, we have these land assets, we have these transportation assets, we have these workforce assets. There's kind of a discovery phase where people invest in finding out about different sites. They think Detroit just has to put those costs to zero. They have to do all of the information gathering. Joan was saying in her class correctly that economic development as a game can often be kind of a game of fads, but it's also a game. It also has a big momentum component. And Dan mentioned that they got CompuWare and Quicken to move headquarters downtown on Woodward. Now every IT in the company in the country that's looking to locate a headquarters is going to think about, well, Quicken did it, CompuWare did it. They land a third one, this fourth one becomes even easier. And there are pockets of momentum in different parts of the city. That if a couple of these could pan out, Detroit still would have a ton of work, but it would be great to get kind of the market momentum behind it, and I think it can happen.
No, I talked to the CEO of a New Jersey-based firm, whose name I'm not remembering now, it was X-Cyber something under, but it's in the business of doing the back office work for health insurance, and they've been outsourcing it to Brazil, and now they're outsourcing it to Detroit, in a building across where people speak English, and as the CEO says, it's a 1-hour flight from our headquarters, where they're paying about the same what they were paying in Brazil. He says it's 10% more the cost here because price in the rest of the world has gone up. The cost of transportation and communication obviously is down. And he's already moved 450 people into the building next door to Quicken Loans, which is a bank building that was built in the 1960s. It is by any definition first-class office space. $3.25 a square foot. Loaded. Gross. As I said, when things get cheap enough, it attracts investment.
Wow.
Yes, I'm Margaret Dyson. I'm a student in the Burke program. And there is this sort of underlying tension that's come out of these two talks about getting community buy-in and community investment and overcoming entrenched interests. And the challenge that exists for planners who are saying, well, we should put this here, we should put that there. These properties are owned by people unless they've been taken by the city. How do you balance those two things in a realistic way? And how do you, as a journalist, start thinking about supporting this notion of planning, supporting the notion of a mayor who says individual interests need to take a back seat. In this case, that's not a very popular position to take, and it's not a position that's generally supported in the American experience.
No, it certainly
They're
isn't.
very individually focused.
No, the notion that you're saying, I'm sorry, when your house catches fire, we aren't going to be able to come there, is about as heartless as you can get. Now, it's a little bit less heartless if you say, and we're going to move you into a house of your choice because in this block, in one of the core areas that we're going to continue to invest in, there are so many abandoned houses and foreclosed houses, we can give it to you for free. And you won't even pay taxes on it if you maintain it for X years. The city comes out ahead on that. Can you entice people out of their entrenched, the place that can't provide services? Maybe not, and at some point you have to decide, does the community interest outweigh the individual interest? And I think Detroit's in such desperate circumstances that it does. Hard to say.
So the press would support urban renewal.
Oh, I don't want to speak for the press. No, I'm not talking about, I think urban renewal, I think was not a very good experience for this country. I think it's urban abandonment is what I'm advocating.
Yeah, in terms of the land assets, again, I think this is just an area where you need visibility. So we didn't show it in this presentation, but the city owns a fair bit of land. A bunch of this land that is vacant very well is in a sort of tax foreclosure status. And so I think, once you get a full inventory, and a group in Detroit called Data Driven Detroit, this terrific local group, did a similar inventory of residential assets. And I think once you can see these together, you can actually kind of see what some of the land assets look like. There are private ownership problems, I will leave it at that, but it's certainly true, as Dan was saying, that there are entrenched economic interests there, and there are, of course, large landholders, and yeah, then you're down to politics and negotiation.
My name is Martin Evans. As a former Canadian, I wondered what role you saw Windsor, Ontario playing in the revival of Detroit.
For those who aren't familiar with it, Windsor, Ontario is the only part of Canada that's south of the United States. You go due south from downtown Detroit, you're in Windsor. It's 1 mile away across the river. I think Windsor has played a very negative role in recent years for one specific reason. It legalized casino gambling. It sucked a lot of people wasting their money across the river. And the city, the Michigan political establishment said, we can't let that happen. Those dollars are leaving, those jobs are over there. We have to have our casino gambling. You know, if there's a worse way for a city to come back economically than to have casino gambling to suck the money away from the people who live there, I don't know what it is. But there are these 2 huge casinos in downtown Detroit, and I blame Windsor for that.
So the Canadian Consul General here would like to comment.
I have heard that every car that's made in the U.S., every car that's made in a Detroit assembly plant that crosses that bridge or a part crosses that bridge 25 times, right? So there's certainly a lot of integration in the automotive assets. I think this is something that's really on people's radar, which is, you know, can you somehow take advantage of having this kind of national border and very good crossing and you know, easy crossing and that sort of thing. But can you kind of make that a seamless border and then take advantage of the Canadian assets and the American assets? So I think people are thinking about it, but it's still maybe a little bit of a kind of to be determined.
Dan can actually tell you about how important it was in terms of the prohibition.
No, there was a great economic trade. The tunnel and the bridge in Detroit were both built for the prohibition traffic. I mean, it was just